It is my pleasure to introduce Miles. So Miles is, as well as being my former doctoral supervisor, he's a governing body fellow here at St Antony's and director of the African Studies Centre. He's a professor of African history based jointly in Oxford's Faculty of History and the African Studies Centre. And alongside those roles at Oxford, he's a research fellow in the Department of Historical and Heritage Studies at the University of Pretoria. And Miles's research focuses on Southern and Central Africa, and he specialises particularly in the history of modern Zambia and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And his diverse body of published work explores social and political change, labour and social movements, extractive communities, military conflict during Africa's Cold War, nationalism, migration and urbanisation, and more recently, environmental history and intellectual history. And these themes are central to Miles's new book, Living for the City, Social Change and Knowledge Production in the Central African Copper Belt, which we are pleased to be discussing tonight. So the book offers a social history of the Copper Belt as a single region, encompassing both the Zambian and Congolese Copperbelt communities. And it combines this social history with examination of how knowledge about the Copperbelt has been produced by both residents of those communities and by outsiders, including historians and social scientists, private companies, missionaries, and colonial and post-colonial government officials. And this results in a rich history of social change, economic inequality and knowledge production in the region. And I'm now going to hand over to Miles, who's going to tell us more about Living for the City.
Thank you very much to Sacha, and thank you to the college for organising this event, and for all of you for spending time here this evening. Africa's mineral wealth and the poverty of its mineral-rich societies is a prominent theme in recent African political and in Africa's recent historical and contemporary debates. Today, the implementation of climate change rests in part on clean energy delivered by cobalt, currently produced in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in ways that involve dangerous living conditions and the pollution of the bodies and communities of local residents. And this is not a new story. The gulf between the production of profitable, strategically vital minerals, copper, uranium, coltan, cobalt, and the persistent poverty of the communities that mine them dates back to the birth of industrial mining in Central Africa a century ago. Now, many causes have been identified as responsible for this historical and contemporary problem. The colonially connected corporations that first produced these minerals in highly exploitative and racially segregated labour conditions, the legal and tax systems that then and now enabled the export of most mine revenue away from countries of production, the political systems, both colonial and independent, that allowed this to occur, the failure of mine nationalisation in the 60s and 70s to drastically alter that situation, and the political corruption it enabled. And more recently, the privatisation of state-owned mines, their sale to dubious foreign owners, and finally, the specific model of exploitation by new Chinese mine owners to address that country's industrial demands in the 21st century. And each of these factors has played a significant part in what, from a macroeconomic geopolitical perspective, is a depressing story of exploitation and immiseration. In this talk, however, I want to tell a rather different and I think more positive story, one commonly missing from so-called resource curse narratives. In the book Living for the City, I tell the social history of Central Africa's Copperbelt towns to explain how these new urban societies created by mining have sought in various ways to claim their share of the wealth they make. Now, that's involved specific political initiatives, industrial action, participation in anti-colonial and post-independence political movements, the holding of demonstrations and protests to make demands of mine companies and the governments that regulate their activities. But mine communities have also pursued more indirect means to improve their livelihoods. Female residents have, for example, regularly and in large numbers carried out both subsistence and commercial agriculture, usually illegally, on the vast swathes of land owned by or leased to mine companies. More prosaically, Copperbelt residents have stolen materials from mine companies to build themselves houses on squatted land adjacent to these fenced areas. Copperbelt residents have written consistently manifestos, letters to newspapers, novels, and more recently, websites and blog posts that advance and articulate their claims. They've carried out legal actions, both locally and internationally, and they've sung songs, they've painted and danced in ways that challenge their exploitation, but also assert their distinctive identity as a mass, cosmopolitan, modern society that has a right to a better standard of living and a greater share of the resources that their land and labour produce. And I want to stress, many of these actions have been effective in redirecting at least part of that mineral revenue to Copperbelt communities. The specific form that this assertion has taken has varied over time and has taken distinct but related forms on either side of the Copperbelt border that divides the now nation states of Zambia and the DRC. And while I don't have time to explain the full history of the growth and development of these initiatives and the identities that underlie them, I'm going to highlight a handful of these most significant aspects that I think continue to be important today. From the early days of the Copperbelt, its new migrant workforce challenged low pay, dangerous working conditions, and racial inequality between African and white workers. During World War II, when the region's copper was vital to the war effort, industrial action on both sides of the border prompted concessions by imperial authorities. In Belgian Congo, limited wage improvements were supplemented by markedly better housing and family conditions that existed alongside close controls over workforce and residents, a system characterized as authoritarian paternalism. In contrast, in British-ruled Northern Rhodesia, labour unions were legalised in the mistaken belief they would constrain industrial action. In fact, the new African Mine Workers Union provided a vehicle for mine workers to use strike action that won substantial increases in wages. The unions also played a significant role in growing mass nationalist movements that helped achieve Zambian independence in 1964. In Congo, however, a ban on national movements that remained in place until 1957 meant that political expression was mainly articulated through ethnic associations, something that had significant consequences for the period following Congolese independence in 1960. Now, colonialism enabled the extraction of African mineral wealth, and decolonization created the potential for new nation states to direct mineral wealth into national development. In Congo, however, the very wealth of these mines in the southern Katanga region led to its secession from Congo days after independence, a secession directed partly and underwritten by Belgian financial interests that sought to maintain control of the region's mines. That prompted UN military intervention and 3 years of conflict between UN and Congolese military forces and the illegal secessionist state, ending in 1963. Zambia became independent the following year. Its government semi-nationalized the mining industry and directed a significant chunk of the resultant mine revenue to the state and thereby to economic diversification projects. State-run initiatives partially developed the economy, but they were drastically curtailed with the downturn in global mineral prices from the early 1970s, a downturn that lasted for 30 years. Meanwhile, Copperbelt communities were increasingly in conflict with post-independence states. In Zambia, they fought for higher wages they believed were merited by their labour and their prominent role in the anti-colonial struggle. Following the declaration of a one-party state in 1972, the Zambian government, once allies of Copperbelt communities in the movement for independence, increasingly saw mine communities as a dangerous political enemy within. Meanwhile, the Congolese Zairian leader, Mobutu Sese Seko, similarly nationalized mine companies, and that measure enabled him to extract vast sums from the industry, and even some of the sizable loans provided by international donors in the late 1970s and 80s to redevelop ailing and now loss-making mines. His vast theft of mine revenue and its relocation to his Swiss bank accounts was overlooked by Western allies due to his central role as a Cold War warrior on behalf of the West. The legacy of the Katangese secession meant the mining region was effectively occupied militarily by the Zairian army, and its population saw little or no benefit from nationalization. The industry's decline was worsened by the failure of the state to reinvest in this, the country's most important economic sector. I want to briefly turn to the position of the Copperbelt's women. Excluded from direct employment in mining and stereotyped by companies and states alike as urban housewives, women on both sides of the border in fact played a vital role in supplementing their husbands' wages and fueling development of the wider economy. Tens of thousands of Copperbelt women farmed, traded, and built small businesses, vital economic activity largely dismissed by states and academics until the 1980s, when it was belatedly recognized as providing helpful economic diversification away from a declining industry. These same women sought to ensure that the resources of the mining industry were used to support the living standards of their families. They, however, lacked any direct representation with mine companies, which negotiated with the governments and also with trade union representatives of their employed husbands. On more than one occasion, Zambian Copperbelt women organized collective protests to demand improvements or resist cuts to mine company provision of housing, healthcare, and education. And in this image from a newspaper in 1981, you can see here in the slide, we see women wearing their husbands' mine overalls and their helmets at one such demonstration. It's an act of public cross-dressing that I think helpfully indicates how these women sought to render themselves visible in the eyes of the company, which recognized only their husbands. Zambia's organized labor movement centered on the Copperbelt was central to the 1991 campaign that returned the country to multi-party democracy. And this was symbolized by the election of trade union leader Frederick Chiluba as the country's new president. Chiluba presided over a radical program of economic liberalization, central to which was the privatization of the state-owned mining company. While that was probably necessary to revitalize this moribund industry, the sale was a corrupt, secretive process that enriched political elites, led to mines being taken over by inexperienced foreign companies, and entrenched a low-tax regime on those companies. The new owners of the mines were no longer prepared to underwrite the social infrastructure of the Copperbelt mining towns, which has thereby declined significantly in recent decades. The story in the DR Congo has been significantly worse. When President Mobutu came under sustained popular pressure for electoral reform in the early 1990s, he manipulated the latent ethnic divisions and conflicts in Katanga to unleash violence and generally destabilize the region. His subsequent overthrow and the years of warfare that followed destroyed much of the infrastructure of Congo's mining towns, an irony considering that many of the actors in that war participated primarily for access to Congo's mineral wealth. A similarly disastrous privatization process to that conducted in Zambia followed, threatening the very survival of these mining communities. In recent years, however, mine communities on both sides of the Copperbelt border have begun to recover and find their political and social voices anew. The gradual opening up of Congolese political space, marked by the problematic election of President Felix Tshisekedi in 2019, has enabled new civic organizations to express the aspirations and grievances of Copperbelt societies more effectively. When mineral prices driven by Chinese demand soared from 2005 onwards, the resulting gulf between company profits on the one hand and low state tax revenues on the other fueled political opposition and has been central to political debate both nationally and in the Copperbelt ever since. The election a few months ago of new Zambian president Hakainde Hichilema has raised hopes that the industry can be reformed so as to ensure a much greater proportion of mine revenue accrues to the government and/or is directed towards productive social and economic development. While in the past, mine communities sought direct compensation in the form of more and better paid jobs and social provision to the families of those employed, today's mines employ far fewer and more skilled workers. And so the terrain of struggle has instead moved on to, among other things, the need for local subcontracting companies to be employed by companies rather than foreign ones, other forms of value-added investment are also sought. And an increasing focus is the environmental effects of mining. In January this year, a lawsuit brought in UK courts by 2,500 Copperbelt residents secured compensation, quite meaningful compensation, for water pollution by one mine company. So as the expanding production of cobalt, vital for clean energy, such as electric vehicles, gathers pace, Copperbelt communities are seeking to ensure that they receive adequate compensation from this growing industry while being protected from its worst effects on lives and livelihoods. Throughout the history of Central Africa's industrial mining, considerable efforts have then been made to ensure that the industry adequately rewards the African societies whose land and labour has been vital to that industry. While the resource curse argument has often depicted this, primarily as a struggle between nation states and global foreign mine companies, I hope this brief presentation has helpfully complicated this picture and stressed the central, but generally neglected, history of Copperbelt communities themselves in continually asserting their right to a larger share of the rewards of mineral extraction. They've justified this right by recourse to claims resting in part on the harsh and hazardous labour involved in mining, and more indirectly on the social reproductive work conducted by Copperbelt women, their families, and these communities as a whole. If the achievements of these claims have only been partial and subject, as they have, to frequent reversal and setback, Living for the City nonetheless emphasises not only the meaningfulness of their persistence, but also their creativity and embeddedness, the embeddedness of these campaignings in the collective consciousness of Copperbelt societies. I haven't had time today to speak about how this finds expression in what you see in front of you now, Copperbelt visual art, or popular music, or novels such as Tram 83. But I want to emphasise in closing that in order to fully understand what are often characterised as purely political and economic or legal questions of mining and industrial production and development, it's vital that such analysis listen to and involve the societies that have been central, not only to mining production, but also to giving it social and cultural meaning over many decades. Thanks for your attention. I think I'm passing back now to Sacha, if I know what's happening.
Yes, thanks, Miles. We're going to open out to a Q&A in a few minutes, but before that, I'm just going to offer a few comments and just raise a few questions. So first of all, in much of the existing literature on the Copperbelt, there's a strong and understandable focus on mine labour and on local and global mineral economies. And this book is engaging with that literature, but part of what the book is doing, I think, is also showing that mining and the forms of labour and economic activity associated with mining were only actually ever one part of the Copperbelt's economy. And I think you highlight that for the majority of the Copperbelt's residents, mine workers included, they were living in difficult circumstances and often depending upon a wide range of low-paid and precarious informal strategies for making a living, including trading and farming. And people engaged in those forms of perceived informal labour, large numbers of whom were women and children, were often considered unemployed and not included in official labour statistics or in academic writing on the Copperbelt. And I wondered how far that picture of more varied labour forms and precarity is particular to these particular extractive communities on the Copperbelt, and actually whether it's something that we can think about to understand the nature of labour and the economy in other extractive communities on the continent, but also beyond. And if so, what do you think can be gained, or can anything be gained in terms of understanding labour and the way that the sort of economies of extractive communities function by thinking more broadly about the types of labour that are actually going on in those places? And the second issue I just wanted to raise is just to return to this issue of gendering the copper belt, which you raised in your talk. I mean, you put women's lives kind of front and center in the book, certainly in the very beginning. The opening of the book is you offer a narrative about women's experiences of migrating to the copper belt and then living through social, economic and cultural changes which shaped the region from the mid 20th century. And you note that focusing on women offers as representative a history of the region as more well-known narratives, which centre on men's experiences of wage labour on the mines. But focusing on women is also a different way of framing and approaching the region's history, particularly for a book which is not explicitly, at least, a book about women and gender, because most of the work that we have that looks at women and gender issues on the copper belt is kind of framing it explicitly through that approach. So I wondered if you could tell us why you decided to open the book by talking about women. Was there something particular that you think can be gained, a particular way of kind of understanding the region's history by taking that approach, as opposed to one of the other obscured or overlooked aspects of the region's history which you touch on in the book? And then secondly, on this issue, I wondered, in relation to the material that you go into in later in the book, where you're talking about the roles that women played in the copper belt communities, talking about particularly the varied domestic agricultural labour that they did, their importance in trading, and the ways in which those activities were vital to not only household economies, but the broader region's economy. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about those issues in relation to knowledge production, and say something about the narratives that copper belt residents have constructed around women's roles in and contributions to these communities, whether those narratives have changed over time and how they differed depending on who was telling the story. I'm going to leave it there, and feel free to respond to as few or as many of those questions as you like before we open up to some broader questions.
Thanks, Sacha. That's very helpful as a set of opening questions. I think that shifting the focus from workplace and institution to wider community was what enabled a wider focus on broader economic activity. And it was only in the conducting of this research, which took 4 or 5 years, and much of which was done by colleagues of mine, some of whom are with us this evening, that it became clear to me that actually to be resident on the copper belt, these are communities of hundreds of thousands, eventually a million or more individuals, of whom only 50,000, 70,000, 80,000 were actually organised, employed directly by mine companies. But all that economic activity was in some respects related to, supportive of, symbiotic with or parasitic on this mining activity. Everyone from the largely female agricultural community to what were known throughout much of this period as night soil workers, those who cleaned latrines, those who cooked food for these communities, were bound up with the economic activity of the mines, and in some ways took it seriously. But they were, as you said, often precarious, often involved in different sorts of labour. So moving that focus out from organised labour to informal and precarious ways of making a living, even those which were often judged not suitable for a modern urban society, like agriculture, like squatting, were part of the picture. Now, I'm not an expert on many other extractive communities, but I think it's clear that if we're going to write histories of mining, we need to look at that wider set of activities. When it's a migrant labour society, we need to be thinking about the economic activity and effect of mining on rural sending communities, how they are affected by the flow of mining wealth, remittances, but also ideas, commodities, and so on, and how they themselves continue to affect urban areas. When we, a good example, I think, I just recently finished supervising David Damtar's excellent thesis on Ghanaian gold mining communities. And one of the things he observes in relation to that is that with the shift from artisanal to industrial mining, women who had been a central part of artisanal mine production are excluded from industrial mining. And they shift to finding different ways of gaining indirectly from the wealth being produced by gold mining, in their case, often by producing food for male mine workers and inserting themselves into industrial economies despite their lack of recognition, often by mine companies. So I think it's an approach that can be and should usefully be adopted for the study of other extractive communities. I think partly the focus on women in this book is inspired partly by my supervisory relationship with you, Sacha, and your insistence on placing gender much more centrally in your work, and that's had an influence on mine over the last 10 years or so. I think while the book, one of the things I wanted to do was draw on gender histories approach, which both place women as central to specific aspects of the study, but also mainstream gender throughout the study. I didn't want gender to be a standalone chapter and then the study turn back only to mines and industry and a kind of default position of the study. So in a way, what I'm doing with placing women right at the start of the story is simply to flip around our established notions of where mining communities might come from, who African migrants might be. We know from histories of migrant societies elsewhere in Africa that women were often the most active early migrants in many respects, and very immediately taking advantage of the economic opportunities that new urban societies and new industries provided. I think it's also to make a comment on the nature of how academic and official representation had seen a region like the Copperbelt. Because it was stereotyped as urban, industrial, and modern, it was equally stereotyped as male, as a place only of industrial production. And so women farmers were neglected and marginalized and sometimes repressed, partly because their activities were deemed messy and out of place in an industrial modern space like the Copperbelt town. So evolutionary narratives which informed official policy and academic analysis often simply missed the role of women or judged it somehow dysfunctional in relation to that. Now, very briefly, because I don't want to take up too much time, I think it's fascinating then to interview, as we did, hundreds of residents of the Copperbelt about these very questions. Because it's very clear that in interviews, if you ask the question to a woman of 50, 60, 70 years, as we often did you work? The answer was often no. And what they meant was they didn't do formal sector work, but they also, in many ways, internalized and expressed this marginalized role of female economic production. It often took a number of questions to persuade someone to talk about their trading activities, their business opportunities, and in more recent years, their formal sector employment. One very senior nurse was very clear to say to me that she earned more than her mine-working husband, but she was clear when communicating with other people to downplay the amount she earned in favor of her husband's prestige and status, which rested on his formal employment. There is work on the more recent period which suggests those things are changing now. Women's jobs, women's employment is seen now as very central to household production. And James Masonda's very recently completed PhD thesis, which was examined a couple of days ago, provides fascinating evidence of women underground mine workers, but also women playing a leading role in household economic management, the production of credit, and how that's both destabilizing, but also providing new forms of gender relations.
Thank you very much. Let's open for questions. We've got a few in the chat already, and I'll just take them as they come in. Sarah, shall I let people ask their questions if they want to, or should I read them out?
I would read them out. We tend to find it takes too much time with the muting and unmuting, and it's just smoother if we do reading out.
That's fine, thank you. Okay, so we have a question from Carl Aaron, who asks, which investors have brought out the best and worst in national leaders, and which, Western or Chinese, are delivering greater benefits and voice to Copperbelt communities? And I'll also give you a question from Dave Anderson, and then we'll sort of take them in little groups. Dave says, so the Copperbelt is one region, but two countries. But does the region have a common cultural identity that transcends the differential histories of nationalisms?
Thank you for both questions. Carl, big question. Let me try and frame it like this. I think that the quality of investors is often directly related to the effectiveness of regulatory regimes and what national governments can do with them. Very broadly, the worst types of investors, the most opportunistic, the most criminal in some cases, have been able sometimes to take control of Copperbelt mines in highly secretive privatization processes carried out in both countries at different times that have, in some cases, led to kickbacks for politicians and have actually imperiled the survival of particular mines. So that isn't that isn't specifically about Western, Indian, Chinese, or indeed offshore in many respects. I think overall, more effective legal regimes, sometimes it's suggested that this creates a disincentive for investment. I think rather it tends to deter the most cowboy type operators and tends to lead to more effective long-term investments. That depends on a range of factors, but that's how I would broadly see it. I think it's true that there is a lot of criticism and hostility of Chinese companies as a whole on the Copperbelt. I think they've generally done a poor job in presenting their case, and they certainly are associated with instances of racial discrimination and hostility or disinterest towards African workers. But I think there's plenty of blame to go around. And there are many other Western sort of companies that are closely associated with short-termism in their operations, unlike the Chinese investors who appear to be investing over the long term. Dave, thank you very much. In a chapter in the book on cultural manifestations, I try and argue that there is a kind of common cultural history. There are quite specific aspects that separate out the region. For example, the prevalence of the extraordinary creativity of visual art that we see in Congo compared to its dearth in Zambia. But on the other hand, a really strong musical tradition which transcends the border and can be understood as a sort of Congolese Copperbelt, a Central African Copperbelt musical form that precisely in the way that the Copperbelt towns do, brings together local African traditions with a range of global musical styles, the rumba that's so central to Congolese and East African music, with other kinds of much more localized musical expression in syncretic and innovative musical forms that precisely have been driven in lyrical content by attempts to explain the nature of urban migration, the loss of the village life, the excitement and challenges of urban life. So I think it is then about how those musical and cultural forms migrate across the border at times, sometimes with economic opportunities and economic decline, and then comes to form, I think, over time, a kind of common cultural expression, which, however, is always changing, which has taken many different creative forms over the period that I've talked about today.
Great, thanks, Miles. We're going to take a question from Salvatore Cosimano. If anyone else has any questions, do pop them in the chat. So Salvatore asks, could you expand a bit on any outlook that you might have on how residents of the Copper Belt in the DRC may articulate political and economic claims in contemporary Congolese politics and economy. How might their voices be amplified or alternately exploited, co-opted? And particularly as increasing attention is being given to competition between Western and Chinese mining interests in the country, and for example, projects like Grand Inga, and with the elections approaching in 2023.
Okay, thank you, Salvador. I think that we can see today, and I write a little bit in the book about a rising tide of Congolese Copper Belt forms of campaigning and self-expression in particularly, as I've suggested, in relation to the environmental impacts of the current set of companies' activities. We're seeing, I think, increasingly effective joint projects, for example, by Rights and Accountability in Investment and Development. I think RAID is, R-A-I-D, whose website I would direct you to, which has some fascinating jointly produced materials on the negative effects of cobalt mining in the region that have been published just in the last few weeks. So I think what we're seeing is a more and more effective common cause between Congolese campaigning organizations and international bodies and organizations. The challenge for the Congolese Copper Belt communities is that in articulating their views and seeking to insert them effectively into wider Congolese politics and political economic decisions, the support of the region is often interpreted as quite a threatening factor in Congolese politics. Put simply, effectively controlling the flow of revenue from Katanga has often meant undermining the effective self-expression of the region itself, which is often read in problematic ethno-regional ways. So the elimination effectively of the campaign by former Katanga Governor Moise Katumbi, the division of Haut-Katanga into 4 smaller provinces, can all be read, I think, as effective measures taken against the self-expression and the political representation of Katanga in central Congolese politics. I think that we can see certain movements in that regard, but I think that is going to be an ongoing challenge. And we've seen waves of that, I would say, over the last, in some respects, 50 or 60 years. So whether Katanga can find itself more effectively represented at the center of Congolese politics is, I think, something that, well, it remains to be seen. But that tendency and problem of exclusion, in a way, Katanga is too important to be effectively represented at the center. That kind of paradox of economic capacity and strength continues to find expression. It may change. I'm not an expert on exactly how that's developing in terms of party politics at the moment.
Thanks, Miles. We've got a question from Deborah Potts, who asks, do you have a sense of whether real incomes for ordinary people on both or either sides of the Copper Belt are trending up or down at the moment?
I think the evidence of the last 2 to 3 years is that incomes are declining. There was certainly evidence in a discussion I was at with Chinquan Lee and James Masonda in his Viva a few days ago. C.K. Lee made the point that a decade or so ago, not a decade ago, 6-7 years ago, it appeared that basic formal sector incomes were rising and had risen to a relatively manageable level at a certain point. They were coming close to meeting not sort of high prosperous levels of income, but rather at least covering living costs. Since that time, and I think this is partly a reflection of the economic problems that have been faced by copper belt mining companies, partly because of the government's semi-nationalization of some of those companies in the last 2-3 years, wages have ended up have stagnated, inflation has risen, and I think the economic effects globally of COVID have had a kind of effect, a sort of economically downward effect on those. I don't have a better sense of kind of wider economic activity, but our general view tends to be that if the mines are not doing well, other economic activities tend to decline. So it's certainly a part of the context for the opposition victory in the recent Zambian election was certainly an idea that everyone's incomes were suffering, and that was particularly true across the copper belt.
Thanks, Miles. Another question from Dave Anderson, who asks, is the shadow of Katangese secessionism or the ghost of Chambe still evident on the copper belt, and in what ways is that history recalled and presented?
Thanks, Dave. One of my favourite topics, so I'll try and be quick on this. The Katangese secession is sort of remembered in Western political history as a sort of brief and entirely illegitimate sort of movement that was mercifully extinguished and can be helpfully consigned to history. But in Katanga, the secession had significant support. It appeared to offer to many local residents, albeit this was very ethnically defined, the possibility of a kind of continued prosperity of a certain type of mining regime. That created both a support for Chambe at the time and a kind of nostalgia for Chambe in the decades after it, which is often surprising to Western visitors. One of the most striking things, among the many things that former Governor Moise Katumbi did in the early 2000s, in the decade or so he was in power in Katanga, was to build a statue to Chambe in the street, in a central position in the main city of Lubumbashi. And that is absolutely a reflection of a certain nostalgia for the Katangese project that I think continues to be invoked. It is in a certain way one of the reasons why central Congolese politicians are extremely wary about the nature of Katangese identity. We also see continuing manifestations of sort of low-level military rebellions, so-called Mai soldiers who continue to be active, and in doing so invoke a kind of memory of the secession, which they have no direct relationship with, but certainly has a sort of nostalgic quality to it, redolent of a time when the industry appeared to be doing well and Haute-Katanga, at least itself, appeared to be succeeding economically.
Great, thanks, Miles. We have a question from Henk Merkus, who asks, what will be the impact of the high prices on the world copper market on copper communities? Thinking there about wages and living conditions, and on the role of trade unions based on your past experiences.
Henk, thank you. Always good to be asked to judge the future based on the past. Not always a reliable guide to future developments. I think what we know is that high copper prices in the past are a necessary but insufficient factor in ensuring improved wages and living conditions. We saw, for example, from 2005, an extraordinary, sudden, and in some ways relatively unpredicted rise in the global copper price, which rendered many of the deals done at the point of privatization somewhat unproductive for the nation states concerned. Essentially, very low-level tax agreements embedded in these agreements for very long periods and secret to the public. We then saw a kind of rising tide of political opposition to what the mine companies had been promised, which was indeed based on high copper prices. So copper prices are well known in the region, communities react to them, and wage demands are to some extent set accordingly. But so more demands will be made if the copper price is high than if the copper price is low. But of course, that requires local action in order to ensure that those demands are in some way addressed. Trade unions, I think, in the region are historically weaker than they have been in the past. The trade union movement, which was extremely unified in Zambia in the past, is now quite divided and certainly is a far less effective representation of worker interests. Trade unions have always been quite weak in Katanga because of tendencies to political co-option. I think it's also that, as I suggested earlier, rises in wages and working and the living conditions of workers translate much less effectively now into wider increases in the living conditions of the wider Copperbelt population. Workers and their families are a much smaller percentage of Copperbelt populations because technologically advanced modern mines require simply far fewer actual workers to do the work. And those workers tend to be, in some cases, relatively highly skilled and quite well paid. It's the wider community that struggles with this, their attempts to access copper wealth in a more indirect kind of way than has been possible in the past.
Thanks, Miles. We have a question from Wale Adebamwe, and I think this will be our final question of the evening, or set of questions. So Wale asks, do you think that providing the social histories of resource-rich regions of Africa that focus on local agency is far more illuminating than the resource curse-inflected analysis that focus exclusively on corruption, violence, war, and state collapse? Do we gain a greater insight about the complicated reality on the ground through such a perspective? And he mentions here social history, knowledge production, than the collapse thesis embedded in the resource curse or Dutch disease perspective?
In the interest of time, I would probably say yes, and I could probably stop there, Wale. But thank you for that. That's certainly one of the aims in this type of social history. I think the resource curse narrative and sort of the assumptions that underlie it around the hegemony of companies and states to sort of determine outcomes also leads to, I think, an unnecessary pessimistic approach which exclusively focuses on those things you raise, on violence and war and state collapse. There's plenty of misery and unpleasant human experience to go around in the Copperbelt, but in actually engaging with local communities, in understanding their approach, in understanding the way that they, in contrast to academics and states, have historically produced knowledge about their own societies. There is a sort of persistent, if not optimism, then a persistent determination to continue to make claims, to continue to mobilize these histories, to improve individuals' living standards, to hope and to seek ways to improve the conditions of one's children and one's grandchildren, that I think means that frameworks like resource curse and Dutch disease, while certainly functional at one macroeconomic level and in explaining certain things at a very status level, I think do fail to understand how societies themselves have often understood exactly these questions.
Okay, thank you, Miles, and thanks everyone for your questions. We've done very well with time. We probably have time for maybe one more short question if anyone has anything burning that they want to ask. I think then we will bring things to a close. Thanks, Miles. Thanks, Roger, Sarah, Wouter, for organising, and thank you everybody for coming tonight and for joining in this rich discussion. I think I'll hand back to our organisers now.
Thank you very much, Sacha and Miles. That was absolutely fascinating. Thank you, everybody who asked questions. I hope that you were pleased with how fully Miles answered many of those. I feel that he could have gone on for a lot longer, but I'm sure that there will be plenty of follow-up possible, and also I encourage you to go out and read the book. Thank you very much for attending. If anyone has any questions for the Alumni Office, which hosted this evening's webinar, please do not hesitate to look us up on the St Antony's College website. Thank you very much for your time this evening. Thank you.